When German soldiers surrendered to Allied forces during World War II, many expected the worst. They had heard the rumors, the propaganda about brutal treatment at the hands of the Americans. Some had been told they would be starved, beaten, or worked to death. What they found instead would shock them and forever change how they viewed their former enemy. This is the story of over 425,000 German prisoners of war who discovered that captivity in America meant hot showers, abundant food, and a quality of life many had never experienced, even as free men in their homeland. The journey began in the scorching deserts of North Africa. In May 1943, after months of brutal combat, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps finally surrendered. Exhausted, sunburned, and expecting harsh treatment, thousands of German soldiers became prisoners of the British and Americans. One German soldier kept a meticulous diary from the moment of his surrender. On May 13, 1943, he described being marched to temporary holding areas in Algeria, where the first surprise came: the food. After years of increasingly meager German military rations, these prisoners received substantial meals. But this was just the beginning. The real shock came during the Atlantic crossing. German POWs were loaded onto Liberty ships, American cargo vessels that had carried supplies and troops to Europe and would otherwise return empty. These men, who had been taught to fear capture by the Americans, instead found themselves receiving generous meals aboard the ships. As one prisoner later recalled, good treatment began immediately with the quality and quantity of food served at sea. But nothing prepared them for their arrival in American ports. As ships docked in New York and Virginia, processing began that would expose these prisoners to a level of prosperity and organization they had never imagined. Then came the train journey, and here German expectations collided head-on with American reality. The prisoners expected cattle cars or freight trains, cramped, uncomfortable transport befitting enemy soldiers. Instead, they boarded Pullman passenger cars, the same comfortable trains that carried American civilians across the country. The Germans sat in cushioned seats, looking out clean windows at an American landscape that astonished them. Unlike war-ravaged Europe, America showed no signs of bombing, no ruins, no devastation. Cities stood intact, farms were productive. The scale of American prosperity and the sheer size of the country amazed prisoners who came from a Germany being bombed daily by Allied aircraft. One prisoner from the Afrika Korps wrote about boarding what he expected would be a slow freight train to carry them to Camp Clinton in Mississippi. Instead, they found themselves on a sleek, comfortable passenger train. 2 days later, they arrived at their destination, and the surprises were only beginning. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States established approximately 700 prisoner-of-war camps across 46 states. The largest concentrations were in the South and Southwest, Texas, California, the Midwest, and states like Mississippi, Nebraska, and Colorado. These weren't the concentration camps the world would later learn about in Nazi-occupied Europe. These were something entirely different. The camps were built according to Geneva Convention standards, which the United States took seriously. There were practical reasons for this. America held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, but Germany held over 90,000 American and British POWs. The US government hoped that treating German prisoners well would encourage reciprocal treatment of Allied prisoners in German hands. But beyond pragmatism, there was a genuine American commitment to humanitarian standards, and German prisoners noticed immediately housing that shocked them. When prisoners first arrived at camps like Fort Robinson in Nebraska, Camp Hearn in Texas, or Camp Clinton in Mississippi, they encountered facilities that seemed almost luxurious compared to what they'd expected, or even compared to their lives in Germany. The barracks resembled standard military training facilities, not prisons. Each enlisted man received 40 square feet of living space, the same allocation given to American soldiers. If prisoners had to sleep in tents while permanent quarters were being constructed, their American guards slept in tents too, a gesture of equality that astounded many Germans. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, one of 4 major POW camps in that state, the highest-ranking German officers received truly exceptional treatment. 25 generals were housed there, along with numerous colonels, majors, and captains. High-ranking generals had their own individual bungalows with gardens. Even lower-ranking officers received small, private apartments, a level of comfort that exceeded what many had enjoyed in peacetime Germany. The 3 admirals captured during the war were sent to camps in Mississippi, where each had his own bungalow with a private garden. This wasn't harsh captivity. This was accommodation that many German officers could scarcely believe. The revelation of hot water, but perhaps nothing, symbolized the stark difference between German expectations and American reality, quite like the showers. Hans Wecker, a former POW at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, who later returned to the United States and became a physician, recalled that many prisoners had grown up in what he called cold water flats in Germany, apartments where hot running water was a luxury many families couldn't afford. Indoor plumbing itself was often basic or absent in working-class German homes. Now, as prisoners of war, these men discovered American shower facilities with hot running water, not occasionally, not as a rare privilege, but regularly, as a standard expectation. At Stalag Luft 3's Bellaria compound, a German camp that housed Allied airmen, the facilities included wash basins, showers and urinals. But British officer accounts noted that the showers were usually cold, with only occasional access to hot water in wooden tubs. This was typical for German military facilities, even for their own troops. In American camps, by contrast, each set of barracks included proper ablution areas with multiple showers, most offering hot water regularly. Prisoners were encouraged, sometimes required, to shower or bathe regularly as part of camp hygiene standards. For men who had spent months in North African deserts, or who came from homes where bathing meant heating water on a stove, this was revolutionary. The senior British officers in German POW camps had to specifically order Allied prisoners to wash or shower daily, cold water, but we could get an occasional hot water dunk in a wooden tub, and shave at least every other day. In American camps, hot showers were simply available, and prisoners took full advantage of them. One prisoner later wrote that the hygiene standards and facilities in American camps exceeded anything he had experienced in civilian life in Germany. This wasn't punishment, it was an upgrade to their standard of living. The food that changed everything. If the showers impressed them, the food astounded them. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States was required to feed prisoners the same rations provided to American soldiers. And unlike Germany, which by 1943 was experiencing severe food shortages, America had no such problems. The results were remarkable. Meals that exceeded expectations. At camps across America, German prisoners sat down to meals that many hadn't seen since before the war, or in some cases, ever. A typical breakfast at camps in Mississippi included cereal, toast, cornflakes, jam, coffee, milk, and sugar. Milk. A standard lunch might feature roast pork, potato salad, carrots, and ice water. Dinner could include meatloaf, scrambled eggs, coffee, milk, and bread. And this wasn't once in a while. This was every day. Most of the food was prepared by German cooks themselves, using ingredients supplied by the U.S. Army but following German recipes and preferences. This meant that prisoners ate familiar dishes, prepared to their taste, but with an abundance of ingredients that had become impossible to obtain in wartime Germany. Beer was available for purchase at camp canteens. Special meals were provided for Thanksgiving and Christmas. General officers even received wine, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention. If there were experienced cooks among the prisoners, and there often were, the food might actually be better than what their American guards were eating. The portions were generous. One former POW famously recalled, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 185. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes." This wasn't an isolated case. Military. Chaplain Alex Funke, who served fellow POWs at Camp Algona in Iowa, wrote that we all were positively impressed by treatment in the United States, and that prisoners all had been won over to friendly relations with America. Hans Wecker put it simply, "Our treatment was excellent. Many POWs complained about being POWs, no girlfriends, no contact with family, but the food was excellent and clothing adequate." The stark contrast. Compare this to what American prisoners received in German camps. Official U.S. military reports from 1945 stated that Germany has not supplied POWs with rations equivalent either in quantity or quality to those issued garrison troops. A U.S. quartermaster dietitian who examined an official German camp menu submitted through neutral Swiss observers declared the food was insufficient to maintain life in a normally active person. American POWs in Germany survived largely on Red Cross food parcels supplemented by German rations of bread, barley, potatoes, cabbage, and occasional horse meat. When Red Cross parcels were delayed or didn't arrive, prisoners faced genuine starvation. German POWs in America faced no such privation. They gained weight. They had energy for sports and recreation. Some prisoners later admitted the food in American camps was better than what their families were receiving back in bomb-ravaged Germany. The abundance didn't stop with food and hygiene. American camps offered prisoners a quality of life that led some to describe captivity as a golden cage, a phrase that appeared in multiple prisoner accounts. Recreation and entertainment. At most camps, prisoners had access to extensive recreational facilities. Soccer was the most popular sport, hardly surprising for Germans, and camps organized competitive leagues. At Camp Carson in Colorado, during just 1 month in early 1946, 97 different sporting events were held. Prisoners also played volleyball, horseshoes, and various other sports. Beyond sports, camps offered remarkable cultural opportunities. Prisoners formed orchestras and gave concerts. At Camp Carson, 99 musicians staged 18 concerts in a single month. Theaters were constructed, where prisoners mounted elaborate productions. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners created their own theatrical performances. One Missouri camp, according to prisoner Fritz Enslin, featured a cabaret theater and even a dance group consisting of 12 girls, male prisoners playing female roles, trained by a ballet master, who gave performances regularly attended by American officers. Educational opportunities abounded. Many camps offered classes in English, mathematics, history, bookkeeping, mechanical drawing, bricklaying, and other subjects. English language classes were particularly popular, as prisoners anticipated eventual repatriation to a defeated Germany, where English might prove useful. At Fort Jackson in South Carolina, the curriculum included German, algebra, bookkeeping, mechanical drawing, and various trades. Prisoners had access to camp libraries. They could purchase items at canteens using coupons earned from their labor. Cigarettes, toiletries, snacks, reading and writing materials, and other goods were available, creating an economy within the camps. Religious services were provided, with chaplains assigned to serve prisoners' spiritual needs. Catholic and Protestant services were common, and prisoners practiced their faith freely and fervently, more freely in many cases than they had under Nazi rule in Germany. Some camps even had printing presses, where prisoners produced their own German-language newspapers. These sophisticated publications included in-depth articles, sports scores, and classified advertisements. Camp Shelby in Mississippi had its own newspaper, the Mississippi Post, where prisoners reported on athletic events and camp news, entertainment from home. Prisoners could subscribe to American newspapers and magazines including the New York Times, Lifetime, Look, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post. They watched Hollywood movies and cartoons. Camp theaters screened films regularly, including movies starring Marlene Dietrich, the famous German actress who had emigrated to America and become a U.S. citizen, much to the Nazis' displeasure. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, part of a secret intellectual diversion program, prisoners watched carefully selected films meant to expose them to democratic values without seeming like obvious propaganda, something the Geneva Convention prohibited. The program aimed to expose prisoners to the facts of American history, the workings of democracy, and the contributions made to America by peoples of all national origins. Work, wages, and unexpected kindness. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, though officers could not be compelled to labor. The United States put this provision to practical use, employing German POWs across the country to address severe labor shortages caused by American men serving overseas. fair labor and decent pay. German POWs worked on farms harvesting wheat, cotton, tomatoes, sugar beets, asparagus, and other crops. They worked in canneries, mills, lumber operations, and various industries. Any work deemed not directly related to the war effort or dangerous. Farmers contracted with the government for POW labor, paying about 40 to 45 cents per hour per worker. The government retained most of this to offset the cost of housing and feeding prisoners. But the POWs themselves received 80 cents per day, roughly equivalent to an American private's pay, which they could spend at camp canteens. Officers received even better treatment. They weren't required to work, but still received allowances, $20, $30, or $40 per month depending on rank. These were substantial sums in 1940s dollars. Prisoners who refused to work faced consequences, several days of confinement on bread and water rations. But these measures were rarely needed. Most prisoners were willing to work, and many found the labor arrangement surprisingly fair. Relationships with Americans. As prisoners worked alongside American civilians, unexpected friendships developed. In rural areas particularly, where labor was desperately needed, Germans and Americans often formed bonds of mutual respect. Kelly Holthus of York, Nebraska, remembered 10 or 11 German prisoners working across the road from his family farm in 1943. They stacked hay, worked in the sugar beet fields, did any chores. There was such a shortage of labor. Keith Buss, who lived in Kansas, recalled 4 POWs arriving at his family farm in 1943. A lot of them were stone masons. They built us a concrete garage. No level, just nail and string to line the building up. It's still up today. Don Kerr, who delivered milk to a Kansas camp, said, "I talked to several of them. I thought they were very nice. Some prisoners were invited into American homes for meals, especially during holidays. In Minnesota, Farmer Henry Peterson became particularly well-liked by his POW workers. He bent camp rules by buying prisoners beer and taking them into town, including trips to a movie theater and a local tavern." Tom Bjerke, curator of the Fort Robinson Museum, noted that initial apprehension quickly dissipated. People thought of the POWs as Nazis, but half of the prisoners had no inclination to sympathize with the Nazi Party. Fewer than 10% were hardcore Nazi ideologues, he estimated. For many prisoners, these interactions provided their first real exposure to Americans as individuals rather than enemies. The experience would profoundly affect their views. Unauthorized fraternization. The warmth of American treatment sometimes led to complications. Unauthorized fraternization between American women and German prisoners became a problem at several camps. Some Germans met their future wives while prisoners, relationships that began despite regulations against such contact. Several camps held social receptions with local American girls. In areas with German-American populations, there was often linguistic and cultural common ground. The Lukchins family in Nebraska, for instance, had German ancestry, and the father spoke fluent German. They maintained a lively letter exchange with their POW farmhands, and even sent them food and clothing after repatriation. The transformation, from enemy to friend, the shock of prosperity. What struck many German prisoners most deeply wasn't just the treatment they received, but what it revealed about America itself. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, decadent and incapable of sustained military effort. They expected a struggling nation strained by war. Instead, they discovered a country of staggering industrial capacity and agricultural abundance. Prisoners traveling by train across America saw city after city, farm after farm, all untouched by war. They saw the massive scale of American manufacturing. They witnessed a standard of living that exceeded anything in wartime or even peacetime Germany. Heino Eriksson, a German private captured in Tunisia, recalled the long journey from New York to Texas. Compared to where we had been, Camp Hearn was good. We had clean bunks, good food, and things were finely regulated. The painful ironies. Not all prisoners received equal treatment, and some injustices in American society became painfully apparent in the camps. In the segregated South, German POWs sometimes received better treatment than African American soldiers serving their own country. Black soldiers wrote letters describing instances where they were forced to dispose of POW waste, where German prisoners ate in restaurants that refused to serve black American servicemen, and where POWs had access to facilities marked whites only, while black troops did not. Corporal Rupert Drimmingham famously wrote to Yank magazine in 1944 about watching German POWs sit at tables and be served meals in a lunchroom where he and 8 other black soldiers were forced to eat in the kitchen, out of sight. These incidents revealed uncomfortable truths about American society, but also something else. Even America's enemies received treatment that America denied to some of its own citizens. The German prisoners experienced a version of America that was simultaneously generous and deeply flawed. Return to devastation. When the war ended in May 1945, repatriation began, but many prisoners expressed mixed feelings about returning home. America remained prosperous and intact. Germany lay in ruins. Cities had been bombed to rubble. Food remained scarce. The German economy was shattered. Families had been scattered or killed. One prisoner's experience was typical. He had gained 57 pounds while a prisoner in America, eating better than at any time in his life. Now he would return to a defeated, devastated homeland where starvation was common and rebuilding would take decades. Some prisoners tried to delay repatriation. Others, like Heino Eriksson, determined to return to America as free men once they could. Eriksson eventually did exactly that, settling in the United States permanently. Hans Wecker, the former POW who had been so impressed by his treatment at Fort Robinson, also returned to America after the war and became a physician in Georgetown, Maine. The question of justice. As the war drew to a close and Allied forces liberated Nazi concentration camps, American attitudes toward German prisoners shifted when films and photographs revealed the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. Americans who had been generous toward German POWs felt betrayed and angry. How could they have treated these men so well when Germans had committed such atrocities? The War Department responded by reducing German POW rations from about 2,000 calories per day to approximately 1,200 calories. Work details became harder. Prisoners were forced to watch films showing the liberation of concentration camps, confronting them with what had been done in their names. Yet even with these changes, German POWs in America still fared better than most civilian populations in war-torn Europe, and far better than prisoners held by other nations. The question remained, was such generous treatment of enemy soldiers justified? Defenders pointed to several considerations. First, most German POWs were ordinary soldiers, not Nazi party members or concentration camp guards. Many had been conscripted. They fought for their country as soldiers do, without necessarily supporting Nazi ideology. Tom Bucher estimated fewer than 10% were hardcore Nazi believers. Second, the Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and America's adherence to it may have saved Allied prisoners' lives. Germany generally treated American and British POWs according to Geneva standards, partly because they feared reprisals against German POWs in Allied hands. Over 93,000 American POWs in German camps survived largely because both sides followed international law. Third, many German prisoners underwent genuine transformation. Exposure to American prosperity, democracy and values changed minds that Nazi propaganda had shaped. Some prisoners who arrived as convinced Nazis left as believers in democracy. Finally, treating prisoners humanely reflected American values at their best, a commitment to human dignity, even toward enemies, a belief that civilized nations must maintain standards even in war. Legacy and lessons what they built. The physical evidence of German POW presence remains scattered across America. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners constructed an elaborate concrete fountain and a waist-high castle complete with turrets and a moat, which still exists today. Keith Buss's concrete garage in Kansas, built by German POWs using only nails and string, still stands. Across the country, similar structures endure as unexpected monuments to this chapter of history. But the real legacy was human, not architectural democracy's quiet victory. The secret intellectual diversion program, called the Factory, operated out of Camp Kearney in Rhode Island under Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison. Working with anti-Nazi POWs, American officers distributed books banned by Hitler, showed carefully selected films, and created Der Ruf, a German-language newsletter written by POWs for POWs that mixed pro-democracy content with entertainment. This program remained secret throughout the war, but it achieved remarkable success. Prisoners were exposed to ideas Nazi Germany had suppressed. They saw films documenting Nazi atrocities. They read literature and philosophy Hitler had banned. They encountered arguments for democracy and human rights. Many prisoners returned to Germany and became advocates for democracy in the post-war years. They remembered American generosity and contrasted it with Nazi brutality. The hot showers, abundant food, and humane treatment became powerful arguments for American values. The men who returned. Not all former POWs returned to Germany. Many, like Hans Waker and Heino Eriksson, eventually emigrated to America. They brought skills, education, and a deep appreciation for the country that had treated them well. Those who remained in Germany often maintained contact with Americans they'd met. The Luetjens family continued their correspondence with former POW workers, sending food and clothing to Germany during the difficult post-war years. Eventually, the Luetjens visited some of their former workers in Germany. These personal connections, multiplied across thousands of families, created bonds between former enemies that transcended wartime divisions. The hot shower, that simple, everyday amenity, became symbolic of everything German POWs discovered in America. It represented prosperity, a nation so wealthy that even prisoners enjoyed luxuries unavailable to many civilians in wartime Germany. It represented standards, a commitment to humane treatment encoded in law and genuinely practiced. It represented values, a belief that even enemies deserved dignity. That civilization meant maintaining standards even under stress. For men who had grown up in cold water flats, who had suffered through North African deserts and Atlantic crossings expecting the worst. That hot water flowing freely represented something almost incomprehensible, a captor more generous than their own government had been. They expected punishment. They received care. They expected privation. They received abundance. They expected cruelty. They received humanity. In the end, perhaps 425,000 German prisoners learned more about democracy from hot showers and full meals than they could have from any number of political speeches. They experienced American values in action, and many carried those lessons home to help rebuild a democratic Germany from the ruins of Nazi tyranny. The barracks are gone now. The guard towers dismantled. The barbed wire removed. But the story remains, a testament to what happens when a nation treats even its enemies with dignity, and how such treatment can transform hatred into understanding, enemies into friends, and war into an unexpected teacher of democracy's deepest values. The next time you turn on a hot shower without thinking, remember, for thousands of men half a world away from home, that simple act was revolutionary. It was proof that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was more generous than they'd ever imagined. And in that discovery lay the seeds of peace,